The city was alive with flashing lights and blaring sirens. A black sedan sped through the empty streets, weaving through lanes, ignoring traffic signals. Behind it, multiple police cars followed closely, their tires screeching against the asphalt. The officers inside were tense, their hands gripping the steering wheels tightly. "He's not stopping," one officer shouted into his radio. The suspect was a known criminal, wanted for multiple offenses. The chase had been going on for nearly 10 minutes, and every second felt like an eternity. As they approached an intersection, something unexpected happened. A stray dog wandered into the middle of the road, standing its ground as the speeding cars approached. The suspect had a split-second decision to make: swerve or hit the dog. The suspect's car skidded to a halt, just inches away from the dog. The police cars stopped just behind, their doors flying open as officers drew their weapons. But their eyes were on the dog, a scruffy-looking mutt with piercing eyes. It stood there, unwavering, as if it had deliberately placed itself in the way of the speeding vehicle. The officers approached cautiously, their hearts pounding. "Move the dog, we need to get the suspect," one officer shouted. But before anyone could react, the suspect opened his car door and did something no one expected. He got out, hands raised, looking directly at the dog. The officers froze, watching as the suspect slowly knelt down before the dog. "You again," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the noise of the sirens. The officers exchanged confused glances. One officer cautiously approached the man, hand still on his gun. "You know this dog?" The suspect didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small crumpled photograph. He stared at it for a moment before looking back at the dog. "I thought you were gone forever," he murmured. The officers weren't sure what to make of the scene, but one thing was clear: this was no ordinary stray. The suspect, identified as Mark Reynolds, was handcuffed and placed in the back of a squad car, but his eyes never left the dog. One of the officers, Officer Jensen, decided to take a closer look at the photograph Mark had dropped. It was an old picture of a younger Mark, standing next to the same dog. The image was faded, but the connection was undeniable. "This isn't just any dog," Jensen muttered. The other officers exchanged glances. "We need to get this dog checked out. Something tells me there's more to this story than we think." At the station, while Mark was being processed, the officers brought the dog inside. It refused to leave the suspect's side, growling at anyone who tried to pull it away. It was clear that this dog had a deep attachment to Mark. But why? Jensen made a call to the local animal shelter to see if they had any records of the dog. Within an hour, he had his answer. This dog was reported missing 3 years ago. And guess who the registered owner was? The room fell silent as Jensen revealed the name on the file: Mark Reynolds. 3 years ago, Mark had been arrested for a minor offense and sent to prison. With no family to care for his dog, he had been forced to let it go. The dog, however, never stopped searching for him. When Mark was released, he had nothing: no job, no home, no support. He fell into a life of crime, thinking his past had abandoned him. But his dog hadn't. It had been roaming the streets, waiting, searching. And on this fateful night, when Mark thought he had no way out, his old companion had found him again. Officer Jensen couldn't shake the feeling that this case was different. Mark had made bad choices, but looking at the way the dog refused to leave his side, Jensen saw something rare: genuine love and loyalty. After a long conversation with his superiors, Jensen made a bold proposal. "What if we give Mark a second chance?" The room erupted in protest, but Jensen stood firm. "He's not a hardened criminal. He just lost his way. Maybe this dog showing up was a sign." After much debate, the police offered Mark a deal. If he agreed to go through rehabilitation and work community service, they would reduce his sentence. Mark hesitated at first, but one look at his dog, and he knew he had to take the chance. "I owe it to him," he said. The dog wagged its tail for the first time that night. as if it understood. And so began Mark's journey to redemption, all because of a dog that never gave up on him. As the officers stood frozen, their hands still on their weapons, the dog let out a low whimper. Its eyes, deep and sorrowful, darted between the officers and the suspect on the ground. It was as if it was trying to say something, trying to make them understand. The suspect, still panting, looked at the dog with disbelief. That's not just any stray," he muttered under his breath. The lead officer, still wary, stepped forward. "You know this dog?" The man hesitated, his face suddenly clouded with emotions. "I think I do," he admitted, his voice cracking. The dog inched closer, sniffing the air as if confirming something. Then, to everyone's astonishment, it wagged its tail. The officers exchanged glances. The tension in the air was thick, yet there was something undeniably touching about the way the dog looked at the suspect. It wasn't aggression, it was recognition. The suspect sat up slightly, his eyes not leaving the dog. "This dog, I had a dog just like this when I was a kid. He saved my life once," he whispered, lost in thought. The officers were skeptical. "Are you saying this is the same dog?" The man shook his head. "No, that's impossible. But those eyes, they remind me of him." The dog suddenly barked, stepping closer, and nudged the man's hand with its nose. It was as if it was offering comfort to a man who is being pursued by the law. The lead officer frowned, watching the suspect and the dog. He had been in the force long enough to know when a man was lying. But this was different. There was something in the suspect's expression, something raw and real. The suspect exhaled sharply. "I made a lot of mistakes," he admitted. "But if this dog hadn't stopped me tonight, I probably wouldn't be alive." The dog turned its head, its ears perking up, as if it understood every word. One of the junior officers whispered, "Sir, should we still take him in?" The lead officer hesitated. This was no ordinary chase. The officers stood in silence, absorbing the weight of the moment. The suspect, once desperate and fleeing for his life, now sat still, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the dog's fur. The lead officer exhaled, his grip loosening on his weapon. "You say this dog saved your life tonight?" The man nodded. "I was running, not just from you, but from my past. If I had kept running, I might have gotten myself killed. But this dog, it stopped me. It forced me to face what I was doing." The dog, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, licked the suspect's hand. It was an act of trust, one that didn't go unnoticed. The officers exchanged glances. Their duty was clear. They had a job to do. But sometimes, humanity mattered more than protocol. One of the younger officers stepped forward. "Sir, what if this happened for a reason?" The lead officer sighed, running a hand down his face. "You're saying this dog was meant to stop him?" The suspect looked up. "I don't know what I believe anymore, but I do know one thing. This dog didn't just save me, it changed something in me." The dog, as if knowing the weight of the moment, wagged its tail slightly. It had no home, no owner, and yet it had been right where it needed to be, blocking the road, stopping a man from making a fatal mistake. The lead officer clenched his jaw. "We're taking you in," he said firmly. "But this dog, I think it deserves a second chance, too." The suspect nodded, his gaze shifting to the stray. "So do I." The sound of the jail cell locking echoed in the quiet precinct. The suspect sat on the hard bench, staring at the floor, deep in thought. Outside, the dog sat patiently by the station's entrance. Despite the cold, despite the unfamiliar place, it didn't move. It simply waited. One of the officers peered outside and sighed. "He hasn't left," he muttered. The lead officer looked at the dog through the window, something stirring in his chest. Loyalty like that, it's rare. The suspect, from inside the cell, overheard. A bitter smile crossed his lips. "Maybe that's why I don't deserve it." Morning light crept into the station as officers moved about their daily routines. But one thing remained unchanged. The dog, still sitting at the door, eyes fixed on the entrance, as if waiting for someone to come back. The lead officer sighed, grabbing his coffee. "That mutt's been here all night." Another officer shrugged. "Maybe it's waiting for him." The suspect, hearing the commotion from inside, finally stood. He walked toward the bars and took a deep breath. "Let me see him." The officer hesitated, but then nodded. Moments later, the suspect was led outside in cuffs. The moment the dog saw him, it leapt up, its tail wagging furiously, eyes filled with something no one expected: forgiveness. The suspect knelt, his hands still bound, and pressed his forehead against the dog's. The stray nuzzled against him, as if saying, "I was never going to leave you." The lead officer cleared his throat. "Listen, we ran your record. You're not a saint, but you're not beyond saving either." The suspect swallowed hard. "What are you saying?" "You turn yourself in properly, cooperate with the system, and maybe, just maybe, you'll have a future, one that involves this dog." The suspect's breath hitched. He looked down at the stray, who seemed to understand everything without words. And for the first time in a long while, the man made a choice. "I'll do it," he whispered. The dog barked in approval. Days passed, and the suspect, whose real name was revealed to be Daniel, followed through on his word. He cooperated with the authorities, admitting to his past mistakes. His crimes weren't as severe as initially thought, mostly theft and petty offenses, fueled by desperation rather than malice. The court recognized this, granting him a reduced sentence with the possibility of rehabilitation. But one condition weighed heavily on him: separation from the dog. As Daniel sat in his holding cell, he couldn't stop thinking about the stray that had stopped him that night. Would it still be waiting? Had it moved on? "Hey," an officer interrupted his thoughts. "You've got a visitor." Daniel looked up, confused. He wasn't expecting anyone. And then, as the officer stepped aside, his heart nearly stopped. The dog stood there, tail wagging, eyes bright with recognition. Daniel stared, disbelief washing over him. "You brought him here?" The lead officer smirked. "More like he found his way here. He's been hanging around the station every day. Figured he deserves an update." Daniel swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he reached out. The dog immediately leaned into his touch, as if reassuring him that nothing had changed. The officer crossed his arms. "Listen, I spoke to some people. If you're serious about turning your life around, there might be a way for you to keep him." Daniel's head snapped up. "How?" "You qualify for a rehabilitation program, community service, job training, counseling. If you complete it, you won't just walk free. You'll walk out of here with him." Daniel felt his throat tighten. A future with the only soul who had never abandoned him. It almost seemed too good to be true, but deep down, he knew this was his chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. Daniel's rehabilitation started immediately. He was transferred to a facility where he worked during the day, cleaning streets, helping in shelters, and attending therapy sessions. It was grueling, but for the first time in his life, he felt purpose. The only thing that kept him going. The promise that, once he was free, his loyal friend would be waiting. Meanwhile, the dog, now affectionately named Lucky by the officers, stayed at the station, becoming something of a mascot. Officers fed him, played with him, even made him a little bed in the break room. But no matter how much love Lucky received, he still waited by the entrance every evening, staring at the doors as if expecting Daniel to walk through them. And one day, he finally did. The day Daniel completed his program, he was handed a small bag of belongings and a simple statement: "You're free to go." But freedom didn't sink in until he stepped outside and saw a familiar figure sprinting toward him at full speed. Lucky barreled into him, knocking Daniel to the ground with pure joy. His tail wagged so fast it was a blur, his excited whines filling the air. Daniel laughed, tears pricking his eyes. "You really waited for me, huh?" Lucky licked his face, as if to say, "Of course I did." The officers watched from the doorway, smiling at the reunion. "Where will you go now?" one of them asked. Daniel looked down at Lucky, then out at the open road. "Wherever he takes me," he answered, and with that, man and dog walked away together, stepping into a future neither of them had ever imagined, but one they both deserved. This could be the ending, but if you want me to continue and expand the story further, let me know. I can add more depth, more emotions, and explore their journey beyond this point. Daniel and Lucky walked down the streets, the air crisp with the scent of autumn. For the first time in years, Daniel wasn't running, hiding, or looking over his shoulder. He was just free. But freedom came with uncertainty. He had no money, no home, and no clear plan for the future. Lucky, sensing Daniel's unease, nudged his hand with his nose, as if reminding him that they still had each other. "Yeah, buddy," Daniel murmured, scratching the dog's ears. "We'll figure it out." As the sun began to set, they found shelter in an abandoned building. It wasn't much, but it was warm. Daniel curled up next to Lucky, listening to the soft sound of his breathing. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to hope. The next morning, Daniel woke to the sound of barking. Lucky was at the entrance of the building, his tail wagging as a familiar face approached. "Officer Reynolds, you really thought we'd just let you wander off with no plan?" the officer asked, arms crossed. Daniel hesitated. "Didn't think I had another choice." Reynolds sighed. "Listen, you've been given a second chance. Don't waste it. There's a shelter nearby that helps people get back on their feet. A warm bed, food, and job training. You in?" Daniel looked at Lucky, who sat beside him, tongue lolling in contentment. "Yeah," he said, "I'm in." The shelter was better than Daniel had imagined. It wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a place to rebuild. He was given clean clothes, a warm meal, and even therapy sessions to help him deal with his past. And best of all, Lucky was allowed to stay with him. Days turned into weeks. Daniel took every opportunity he could, learning new skills, attending job training, and even volunteering at the shelter. For the first time, he wasn't just surviving, he was living. One evening, as Daniel helped serve dinner to other shelter residents, a man in a suit approached him. "I've been watching you," the man said. "You're hardworking, respectful, and you don't give up easily. I run a construction company. We need people like you." Daniel was stunned. "You're offering me a job?" The man nodded. "On one condition, you keep showing up, just like you have here." Daniel swallowed hard. "Deal." And just like that, his life took another turn for the better. With Daniel working, Lucky spent his days at the shelter, where he quickly became a favorite among the staff. But one day, something extraordinary happened. A young girl at the shelter, who had refused to speak since arriving, sat silently in the corner until Lucky walked up to her and gently placed his head in her lap. At first, she hesitated. Then slowly, she stroked his fur. And then, she whispered her first words in weeks. "Good dog." The shelter workers were in shock. Lucky wasn't just a companion, he was a healer. And that gave Daniel an idea. That night, Daniel sat with Lucky, deep in thought. "What if we could do more, buddy?" he mused, rubbing the dog's ears. "What if we could help people, just like you helped me?" Lucky tilted his head, as if considering the idea. The next day, Daniel spoke with the shelter director. "I want to train Lucky as a therapy dog," he said. "I think he can really make a difference." The director smiled. "I think you're on to something." And so, a new chapter in their lives began. Let me know if you want me to continue. Their journey is just beginning. Daniel and Lucky started therapy dog training the very next week. The program was intense, requiring discipline, patience, and countless hours of practice. Lucky had always been smart, but now he had to learn advanced commands, how to provide comfort in stressful situations, how to stay calm in crowded environments, and even how to respond to people in distress. At first, it was overwhelming, but Daniel wasn't the type to give up. Neither was Lucky. Each day they practiced tirelessly, building an unbreakable bond. And every time Lucky successfully completed a task, Daniel felt a surge of pride. They weren't just training, they were preparing for something much bigger. After months of training, Lucky was finally ready for his first real assignment. The shelter director arranged for them to visit a children's hospital. Many of the kids there had been through painful treatments, and their spirits were low. As soon as Lucky walked in, everything changed. Children who had been quiet for days suddenly smiled. Some who had been afraid to speak reached out to pet him. Even the doctors and nurses couldn't help but stop and admire him. Daniel watched in awe. Lucky wasn't just helping, he was healing. And in that moment, Daniel knew they were exactly where they were meant to be. One evening, as Daniel was finishing up at the shelter, his phone rang. An unknown number. Hesitantly, he answered. Danielle, a familiar voice spoke. His heart stopped. It had been years since he heard that voice. It was his sister. Daniel hadn't spoken to his family since he'd left home as a teenager. He had assumed they had forgotten him, just as he had tried to forget them. But now, hearing his sister's voice, memories came rushing back. I saw you on the news, she said. You and Lucky, helping people. I had to find you. Daniel swallowed. Why now? Because we never stopped looking for you, she whispered. For the first time in years, Daniel wasn't just thinking about his future. He was thinking about his past, and whether he was ready to face it. A week later, Daniel stood at a small cafe, hands sweaty, heart pounding. Lucky sat by his side, sensing his nervousness. Then the door opened. A woman walked in, his sister. She looked just like he remembered, only older, stronger. The moment their eyes met, she ran toward him, tears streaming down her face. You're really here, she whispered, hugging him tightly. Daniel couldn't speak. He just held her, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Home. Over coffee, they talked about everything. His sister told him about how their parents had searched for him, how they had regretted not understanding his struggles, how they had left the door open, hoping he'd walk through it one day. Daniel told her about his journey, about his struggles, his mistakes, and how Lucky had saved him. Mom and Dad would love to see you, she said softly. Daniel tensed. The thought of facing them was terrifying. But as Lucky nudged his hand, he realized something. He wasn't alone anymore, and maybe, just maybe, he was ready. A week later, Daniel stood in front of the house he had once called home. It looked smaller than he remembered, but the emotions it stirred were massive. Lucky sat beside him, tail wagging, as if encouraging him to take the next step. The door opened. His mother stood there, her face a mix of shock, relief, and overwhelming love. Daniel, she whispered. He took a deep breath. I'm home. And just like that, the years of pain, regret, and distance began to fade. Daniel's parents immediately fell in love with Lucky. He's the reason I'm here, Daniel told them. Scratching behind the dog's ears, his father, a man of few words, knelt down and patted Lucky. Then I owe him everything, he said. That night, for the first time in years, Daniel sat at the family dinner table, surrounded by love, laughter, and the warmth of a home he thought he had lost forever. Months passed, and Daniel and Lucky continued their work as a therapy team. But now, they had a new goal. Daniel wanted to open his own therapy center, a place where people like him, those who had struggled and lost their way, could find healing. It was a dream. But he wasn't dreaming alone anymore. With his family's support and Lucky by his side, he was ready to turn that dream into reality. Do you want me to continue till the end? Their journey is getting even more inspiring. Starting a therapy center wasn't easy. Daniel had no experience running a business, no funds, and only a rough vision of what he wanted. But he had passion. And Lucky. With his family's encouragement, he began researching, applying for grants, and reaching out to local shelters and hospitals. He even started a fundraiser, sharing his story online. Within weeks, donations started pouring in. People resonated with his journey, how a stray dog had saved him, and how he now wanted to help others heal. For the first time, his dream didn't feel impossible. It felt real. One evening, as Daniel was working late, he received an email from an anonymous donor. It was a significant amount, enough to secure a building for the therapy center. His hands shook as he read the message. I believe in what you're doing. The world needs more stories like yours. Make this dream happen. Daniel was speechless. Lucky, sensing his emotions, placed a gentle paw on his lap. The universe had given him a second chance. Now he had to make it count. With the funds secured, Daniel found the perfect location, a peaceful space near a park, ideal for therapy sessions. The renovations began, and so did the hard work. Daniel and Lucky spent every day on site, ensuring everything was just right. They had volunteers, sponsors, and even therapy experts helping them set up. As Daniel watched the empty space transform into a sanctuary of hope, he realized something. This wasn't just a project, it was his life's purpose. The day had finally arrived. The therapy center, named Lucky Haven, was officially open. The grand opening was filled with people, friends, family, supporters, and even some of the children from the hospital Lucky had once comforted. Daniel stood on the stage, microphone in hand, eyes scanning the crowd. This place exists because of a stray dog who once saved me, he began. Lucky taught me the power of love, trust, and second chances. Today, we offer that same hope to anyone who needs it. The crowd erupted in applause. Lucky barked, as if to say, we did it. Within weeks, Lucky Haven became a refuge for those in need. Children with anxiety, veterans with PTSD, and lonely souls who had lost their way, all found comfort in the therapy dogs, especially Lucky. One day, a little boy named Noah arrived. He hadn't spoken in months due to trauma. But when he saw Lucky, something changed. He walked over, sat beside him, and after a long silence, whispered, "Doggy." Tears filled his mother's eyes. Lucky had done it again. One afternoon, Daniel was leading a therapy session when he saw a figure standing at the entrance. A police officer, but not just any officer. It was the same one from the highway chase, the one who had once called Lucky just another stray. The officer approached, removing his cap. I was wrong about him, he admitted. And about you, Daniel smiled. Want to meet the dog who changed my life? The police department had heard about Lucky Haven and wanted to partner with them for community outreach programs. Lucky and other therapy dogs would now help officers cope with stress, visit crime survivors, and even assist in de-escalation training. The same dog who had once been a nameless stray was now a symbol of hope, even to those who had once doubted him. Daniel watched with pride as Lucky, wearing his therapy vest, walked into the police station for the first time. Life had truly come full circle. One night, as Daniel was locking up the center, his phone rang. It was his sister. Mom's not doing well, she said, voice shaking. His heart dropped. Without hesitation, he packed a bag, called for Lucky, and rushed home. This time, he wasn't running away. He was running toward family. Daniel arrived to find his mother weak, but smiling. You came, she whispered. I never stopped loving you, he said, voice cracking. Lucky gently placed his head on her lap, sensing the moment. She stroked his fur. You're lucky to have him, Daniel nodded. No, Mom, he's the one who saved me. She smiled, squeezing his hand. And with that, she closed her eyes, at peace. Losing his mother was devastating. But Daniel didn't fall into darkness this time, because now he had a family, a purpose, and Lucky, who never left his side. Pain didn't break him, it shaped him. To honor his mother, Daniel expanded Lucky Haven, creating a special program for grieving families. Here, therapy dogs helped people process loss, just as Lucky had done for him. His mother's memory lived on, not in sorrow, but in healing. One evening, Daniel was closing up when a woman approached. She was thin, tired-looking, and carried a small dog wrapped in a blanket. I found her on the street, she said, eyes pleading. She's starving. I can't keep her, but I can't leave her either. Daniel looked at the tiny trembling pup, and in that moment, he saw himself. Daniel took the pup in, nursing her back to health. She was weak, scared, and unsure of the world, just like Lucky once was. And just like before, he knew this wasn't the end. It was a new beginning. Years passed. Lucky Haven became one of the most renowned therapy centers in the country. Daniel had helped thousands of people, but none of it would have happened without Lucky. One dog, one moment, one choice. That's all it took to change a life. Lucky grew older, his fur turning gray, his steps slowing, but his spirit remained strong. One evening, as Daniel sat with him on the porch, he whispered, "You saved me, buddy." In every way possible. Lucky licked his hand, then laid his head down. His journey was coming to an end, but his legacy? It would live forever.